What was your irrational fear as a child? I was terrified of the dark as a kid, and we had a storage room attached to our laundry room. There was just a doorway. No door, and then that led to under the stairs. A jar of that. I'd always pretend there was friendly giant octopus who wore a black cow tie with white spots on it that lived under there, and I'd literally talk to him as I was grabbing what I needed. Then when I'd leave, I'd say goodbye and dash upstairs as soon as the light was off. Had several frogs, puppets from a certain YouTube series which I will not talk about. Philip Collins, being by myself. Too many music videos to count. This when my dad would say the name Brunhilde. Atheists, not that I judge them now. Gay people, I actually have very progressive parents. I just didn't understand the idea because I was a stupid little kid. Being kidnapped by guys in red hats. This one bear at my dad's job. That I was in the Truman Show. That chicken would come back to life as soon as I put it in my mouth. As a little kid, still in my pushchair little, my mum would take me into this store. I noticed when I was in there that people would walk into this room, and then a worker would walk out with a mannequin. I thought people were being turned into mannequins, and every time I was wheeled past the area I was trying to look inside to see how they were doing it. It wasn't scary as such. More curiosity and a don't take me in there kind of vibe. Irrational fears as I got older. Ghosts and zombies. The zombie one hit as a teen. I feared throwing anything of mine away, including used tissues or things that are meant to be thrown out after one use. I feared it because I didn't want my DNA going places without me. I decay. Things I've touched and owned being somewhere else. It just felt weird. I almost cried sometimes having to throw things out. I'm way past that now and actually went the opposite route. I'm more of a minimalist as an adult. I think if I didn't nip that in the bud so early, I'd probably be a hoarder. Sudden fires. My mum lived in a tiny duplex for a short time, and my brother and I shared a room. I distinctly remember her telling us that if there was a fire at night, to break our window and get out in the backyard. The only problem was that the backyard was full of dry weeds nearly as tall as we were. So my little overthinker brain stayed awake, trying to figure out what could be used to break the window, and how we could get over the back fence before the entire yard went up in flames. I was terrified of E.T. as of that scene in the cornfield at the beginning of the movie. My little sister used to shuffle past my door, on the way to bathroom or my parents' room, several times a night. I tried so hard to remember it was just her and not it, but I lost my mind eventually every time. Screamed from under the covers for my mom or dad. Eventually they just made her sleep in my bed. I was allowed to read the unexplained artworks as a kid. I had a reading age of 8 at 4. I was just let loose on the bookshelves. So I read all about such things as screaming skulls, close encounters, spontaneous human combustion, poltergeists, hauntings, tulpas, all the good stuff. On the one hand, it gave me a lifelong interest in Forteana. On the other, I was petrified of all sorts for a very long time. Tornadoes. I had countless nightmares about them growing up. Only once I gained my freedoms I became obsessed with them. It's interesting because the theme of the tornado dreams always hint at the notions of having control or not. Being a child, you're at the whims of a parent's decisions. What if you know something could save you but they didn't know it any better? It was that kind of fear in those dreams. This random noise that I used to hear outside at certain times of the day. I thought it was coming from the sky, and that the sky was about to fall or explode or something. Everyone else acted like it was no big deal, and I still don't know what it actually was. Most likely it was one of the many factories mills near my house. And I was 5 and it seemed that a falling sky was more the likely cause. I was so goddamn afraid of getting drafted into war. My uncle got drafted into Vietnam, and for most of my childhood I always just assumed I would get forced into a war one didn't care about too. Gave me nightmares of getting shot to death in a jungle for years. Fuck LBJ. He's a fucking monster of a human. I don't care how jumbo his dick was or if he signed off on the Great Society. For me, it was staying home alone. Even as a teenager, the idea of being the only one in the house would send shivers down my spine. Every creak of the floorboard, every rustle in the bushes outside. My imagination would run wild with burglars and monsters. Looking back, it's hilarious. But man, those nights alone were rough. What were some weird fears you guys had as kids? I had a few, but the silliest was probably the boots. From these boots were made for walking. My mum sang it to me one day, while playing, and I became convinced there might be disembodied boots marching towards me from afar. Always knowing my location, planning to walk all over me until I die. Maybe. I had no way of knowing their plans. It didn't last long, fortunately. I was in 4th grade when my grandma Norma let me watch Friday the 13th. And for years I couldn't sleep in my bed, or swim in a lake or a pond. That scene where Jason stabbed the girl in the neck from under the bed and when he grabbed people from under the water, it honestly still freaks me out. I absolutely cannot swim in fresh water, and I can't sleep on my back. I'm 51. The song Moon Shadow by Cat Stevens. I would cry in fear when it was played and wouldn't enter a room if it was playing. My family still teases me to this day about it. I'm 42. I remember being really creeped out by the lyrics because I'd picture this man on a cliff in the dark under the moon slowly losing his body parts. Honestly, I'm still a little scared by it, lol. Trees underwater, submerged enough to still see them. Yaking when I was younger. There was this one section of the lake that was low, and had low-cut tree stumps the kayak would pass over. You could feel it through the plastic part little me had to sit on. He also had to push the weaker cut trees away with the paddle. I had a weird fear of watching balloons float away. Like after a birthday party when the kids will let the helium balloons go and watch them until they disappear. I always had to look away. It filled me with an unexplainable sense of dread. To this day I have no idea why. And I can watch balloons float away now while only being slightly uncomfy. My parents had this portrait of a mime pouring a glass of water that scared the shit out of me as a kid. My parents had to hide it from the living room. I used to have nightmares that the mime in the portrait would come to life and make me watch horror movies, or make me stand in a dark hallway with no way of turning on the lights. That tornadoes are going to spawn in blizzards. I asked one of my teachers when I was little, and they explained about how it wasn't possible. Then, when the 2013 blizzard hit, I was helping my siblings move some stuff and heard some rumbling. We thought it was the wind, but when we saw lightning, we scrambled back inside. Dogs. Our neighbors had these asshole poodles that would jump the fence and terrorize the neighborhood. Chased me around in the backyard more than once. Also got chased out of a park by a Dalmatian, off its leash. Maybe it wasn't so irrational. Took me years to come around to dogs and realize that most were okay. After having watched Paddington as a 4-year-old, I got very scared that the bathtub could flood the house if it got to full and the water went over. Logically, anytime my father would start his bath water filling and leave it unattended for more than a minute or two, I would scream at him to watch the tub. We had to drive by a tank to get to my grandmother's. 2 tanks actually. They were out of commission but ominous. My uncle, a prankster, told me age 5 that they unpredictably shot cars. Not often, but sometimes. I would duck down in the back seat and just pray to get by them in one piece. Did that for years. Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and pretty much anything dressed up in a mascot costume. Didn't matter what it was. You'll know Carnival Cruise Line's Funship Freddy. That thing absolutely petrified me. I'm sorry to whoever was dressed as Freddy when 5-year-old me screamed and fainted at the sight of him. I had a bedding set that was drawings of dolls in old-fashioned clothing that absolutely terrified me, yet my grandmother, whom I lived with, insisted on putting it on from time to time. I would have extreme night terrors and would be visibly shaking coming up to bedtime. She did care, old people, eh? I was afraid that when I was in the bath, a whale would suddenly appear out of thin air and eat me. This was shortly after seeing Pinocchio in 1940. I never told my parents about this because even as a small child. I knew it was bananas. So, I just continued to take baths while fully terrified. Was a preteen, but I guess it still counts. Being pregnant, got my first period when I was 11. Every time my cycle was late, I worried about being the new Virgin Mary. I swear on my life I was so worried I cried sometimes. But never told anyone about this fear because it was too embarrassing. Shrinking, I'd have a nightmare that wasn't really a bad dream. It was like a normal dream. But there was that sense of dread pounding in my head. I'd wake up from it with that dread still pounding, and everything around me just seemed so big and intimidating. And I felt like I was shrinking. The hanging lamp I had in my room, I had to bad dreams about it as a kid. When I was still in my crib, when I dreamed that a ghostly Ronald McDonald came out of the lamp. And the next was when I was about 6 or 7, and I dreamed that the lamp came alive and wanted to kill me. As a child, I had an irrational fear of shadows in the dark. I would often imagine them as ominous creatures lurking in corners, ready to pounce. It took time and reassurance to overcome this fear and realize that shadows were simply the absence of light, not something to be afraid of. I watched a ridiculous movie about Bigfoot when I was about 5. And it broke through a window and killed someone. My shower had a window, and I was always certain Bigfoot was out there. Also, quicksand. I was convinced you could be suddenly sucked into the earth anywhere you went.